Oh, okay. Now we've opened it up to everybody then.
Sorry, you didn't want to do that?
Not yet.
Sorry.
That's all right.
But now my video works.
There we go. All right. Wonderful. So Dr. Fields, are you all set to load your presentation then? I think we're going to begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of the 2021 Great Decisions lectures. We kicked off things 2 weeks ago with a presentation on global supply chain, and tonight we are going to be talking about the Korean Peninsula and some of the recent developments that have been occurring there. In a moment, I'm going to have one of St. Norbert's students introduce the speaker, but right now I wanted to make certain that you all knew that this was being recorded, and the recording will be available in the next couple of days at St. Norbert's Great Decisions website. Also, on behalf of President Brian Brees of St. Norbert, would like to welcome you tonight to this program. My name is Daniel Stoll, and I'm Associate Dean for Global Affairs. This year, we're once again delighted to partner with the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and I'd like to introduce my colleague right now, Dr. David Corey, who will say a few words as well before we get kicked off.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for everybody for joining us tonight on this very cold evening in our Zoom virtual meeting. And we're very pleased to partner again with St. Norbert this year for the Great Decisions. And very pleased as well to also partner with the Center for East Asian Studies at UW-Madison. More about tonight's speaker in a little bit from the student who'll be introducing him, but I just wanted to point out that on the final one, on Wednesday, April 14th, we'll also have a speaker, as the final in this series, that is also in collaboration with the Center for East Asian Studies at UW-Madison. So we're very pleased about that and to be collaborating again, once again, with everyone at St. Norbert. So welcome, everyone. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. So if this works properly, we're going to be joined by Ellen Crofts, who is a student here at St. Norbert College. Ellen, I believe you are on, I'm going to make you a co-host, and you should be able to join us if you take your mic off, and please go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everyone. Today's guest speaker for the Great Decision Lecture Series is Dr. David Fields. Dr. Fields earned his Ph.D. in U.S. Diplomatic History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017. He is currently the Associate Director for the Center of East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has published several academic essays and reviews, as well as the book entitled Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea, and he has edited several others, including The Diary of Syngman Rhee, which is published by the Museum of Contemporary Korean History and the Journal of American East Asian Relations. Along with these publications, his research and analysis has been featured on various media outlets, including National Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Radio, Washington Post, C-SPAN, and CNN. Thank you, Dr. Fields, for joining us this evening.
Ellen, thank you so much. Before we begin with David, I'd just like to remind folks that if you have questions for our speaker, please put them in the question and answer function at probably at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Corey and I will be watching those, and we'll be able to share those with our speaker. At that point, our format is, as usual, a presentation of about 30-35 minutes from our speaker, and then we'll move into question and answer for the remainder of our hour. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to David, and I am going to back out as well. And I think, Dr. Curry, you're going to have to put it into speaker mode.
Did that work?
David, are you able to load your presentation?
All right, let me.
There we go.
let me get here, and then I will hit present.
There we go.
All right, and let me just start my timer just to make sure. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you tonight. Thank you to David and Dan for the invitation. Thank you to Ellen for that wonderful introduction. As Ellen said, I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm so grateful for this invitation because at the University of Wisconsin and at all of, I think, our constituent schools, we believe in this thing called the Wisconsin idea, where the university and the community and ideally members of state government come together to discuss issues that are important to all of us. And at the heart of the Wisconsin idea is a collaboration. So it only happens when the university and the community come together. We can't have the Wisconsin idea on our own. And so it's really wonderful to be invited to participate in an event that is not just a university event, but it's a collaboration between two universities and between a broader community. And so I'm really excited to be here to be speaking to you about an issue that I care a lot about. So we're going to talk today about what the future holds for the US relationship with the ROK, the Republic of Korea or South Korea. But as Ellen said, I'm actually a historian by training. So I'm going to spend about a third of my presentation talking about the past, okay? Because the past is so important, and it's not important because history repeats itself. I actually don't really believe that history repeats itself, but it's history that forms the present, okay? And so when we understand history, the history of US-ROK relations, we can understand where we're at today in the relationship. We can understand both the weaknesses and the strengths of the alliances. We can understand the tensions that exist in the alliance. And that will give us a sense of where we are today, but it will also give us a sense of what possibilities might be in the future. It won't tell us what that future is going to be. But as I'm going to lay out in my talk today, I'm going to focus on tensions in this relationship. And I'm going to suspect that at some point, the US-ROK relationship is going to end. It's going to break down. And it's going to break down along the tensions that I'm going to outline. Now, when is that going to happen? I have no idea. I think it's got a lot of life left in it. But I think this is why history is so important. And so I'm going to spend about a third of my time today talking about history. So I've organized this talk around three tensions. Okay, I like to always have 3 points when I lecture. I feel like it helps me keep on task, and hopefully it will help you remember some of the things that I'm going to say tonight. So the three tensions that are going to organize this talk are going to be the tensions over history between the US and the ROK, tensions over North Korea. How should the alliance deal with North Korea? And then tensions over the US-ROK alliance itself, tensions in the structure of the alliance and tensions in the future of the alliance, okay, and in forces that are pulling the societies in a few different ways. Okay, so I'm going to structure my talk around these three tensions. Okay, so first, the tensions over history. And I just want to point out, and I was so thankful for Ellen to mention that I wrote a book, and I still am in disbelief every time someone mentions the title of my book, that it's actually completed and it's actually published. I mean, I worked on it for so many years, and I'm so delighted to see it in print. And I show you my book now because I want to point out that I'm going to spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes on the history of this relationship. So I'm going to just barely scratch the surface. So if you want to know more, okay, the history I'm going to cover is going to be, you can find in my book ad nauseum. However, I understand that a 300-page academic text is not necessarily for everyone. So I also wanted to bring to your attention a lecture that I delivered for Wisconsin Public Television about a year ago on how Korea was divided and why it matters. And the history that I'm going to cover very, very briefly in this presentation, you can find a much more detailed explanation of it in this video. And so I'd be happy to share this link with anybody who wants it. You can also see it in the recording of this. So I'm going to go over the history very, very briefly here. But main thing I want to take, I want you to understand when we talk about the history of the US and the ROK is US-ROK relations do not begin in 1950 when the United States intervenes in the Korean War and saves the ROK from an invasion from North Korea. It's so important to understand that. If you think US-ROK relations began in 1950 or US-Korea relations began in 1950, then you will have a fundamentally inaccurate conception of the relationship. And you will also not be able to understand the Korean perception of the relationship. Because Koreans understand that the history of US-Korean relations is much deeper than 1950. And in fact, it starts in 1882. And it starts in 1882 with the Korean-American Treaty. All right. And I'm going to structure these historical tensions around three traumas, the three great Korean traumas of the 20th century: their colonization by Japan, their division after World War II, and then the Korean War. All right. And the United States is implicated in all three of them. And it's implicated in the colonization of Korea by the Japanese because of this treaty. So when the US and Korea, or then called the Kingdom of Chosun, established relations in 1882, they signed a treaty. And the first article of this treaty has a clause in it which says, if any other power deals unjustly or oppressively with either party, the other, on being informed of the case, will extend their good offices, thus bringing about an amicable arrangement. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Good offices in that article is a technical legal term that refers to mediation. So if Korea gets into difficulties with another power, i.e. Japan, China, Russia, the United States is obligated in that treaty to extend an offer of mediation. It's not obligated to mediate, because that offer is only accepted if both parties accept it. So it's not obligated to mediate, but it is obligated to offer to mediate, to extend an offer of mediation. Well, the problem when this treaty was signed is there was no Korean term for good offices. This is a technical legal term. So in the Korean version of the treaty, which was actually written in Chinese characters, it just says must help. Okay, so if Korea gets into difficulties with its neighbors, the United States must help. All right. So there was a fundamental misunderstanding about what was in this treaty. Many Koreans believed it was an alliance with the United States. And so when they got into difficulties with Japan, who would occupy Korea in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War, and then never leave and start the process of colonization, when they got into difficulties with Japan, they sent envoys to the United States, invoking the 1882 Korean-American Treaty and asking Theodore Roosevelt to intervene in the situation, to offer to mediate. And he refused. He refused to do it, okay? And so for many Koreans, the United States played a minor, and it was a very, very minor, but they played a minor supporting role in one of the great Korean tragedies of the 20th century. And they see Americans as implicated in their colonization by the Japanese. Now, I try to argue against this whenever I encounter this view among Koreans and say, you understand that even if Roosevelt would have offered to mediate, the Japanese would have refused, and Korea would have been colonized anyway. Okay, so I don't really see the American role as being all that significant, but yet it's something that many Koreans believe, and it's something that colors their views of the United States. Okay, that the United States failed to live up to its obligations in the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. Okay, so there's one trauma that involves the United States on the Korean Peninsula. The second one is the division of Korea in 1945. It's crucial to understand that the division of Korea is often described as a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, it was not. It was an American suggestion. The Americans suggested that the United States and the Soviets jointly occupy the Korean Peninsula, dividing at the 38th parallel, and the Soviets accepted it. Okay, there was no negotiations involved at all. It was an American idea. All right. Now this suggestion was never made with the intention of creating separate states on the Korean Peninsula from the American perspective. It was never made with the intention that it was going to be permanent. I think they would be absolutely shocked, Dean Acheson and Charles Bonesteel, to know that in 2021, Korea is still divided. Okay, in their minds, this was something that would probably last just a few years, maybe even just a few months. And what they were doing is they were worried that the Soviets were going to try to create a Soviet satellite on the Korean Peninsula, and they wanted an independent Korea. And so they felt that boots on the ground in the post-war period would help give the United States some leverage to make sure that Korea emerged from Japanese colonization as an independent state and not as a satellite of the Soviet Union. It was never intended to be permanent. Nevertheless, that's what happened. Okay, and Koreans understand that even though it wasn't supposed to be permanent, this was an American idea to begin with. It was the Americans who had this idea. And so again, you can see the United States is to some extent complicit in the second great trauma of the Korean 20th century, okay? The third, all right, you will often hear it said, and I read this probably a couple of times a month, that the United States enters Korea in 1945 and we've been there ever since, okay? This is not true. The United States withdraws from Korea in July of 1949, okay? And it withdraws from Korea over the strenuous objections over the ROK government. Okay? And I'm just realizing I'm a few slides behind here, but it's just images. So here's an image of the National Geographic map that was used to divide Korea. All right, and now we're back on track with the American withdrawal in 1949. The United States withdraws in 1949 over the strenuous objections of the ROK government, who tells Americans that if you withdraw from Korea right now, there is a good chance that the DPRK will invade. And they beg the United States not to do it. And actually, the Central Intelligence Agency will publish a study in the spring that draws attention to this as well, that there is a real danger that the DPRK will invade if the Americans withdraw, okay? And yet the State Department and the Department of Defense overrule these concerns and withdraw from Korea because they want to end the occupation of Korea. They never really wanted to go into Korea in the first place. That was something the politicians came up with. All right. And so the Americans withdraw. And then, of course, in June of 1950, the DPRK invades. And then it's at that point that the Americans come in and save the ROK. But you can understand now from the Korean perspective that while they're very grateful for the United States intervention during the Korean War, they really wish that the Americans had stayed in 1949, and then it might never have been necessary in the first place. All right. So these are three key historical tensions of the United States from the Korean perspective being complicit in some of the worst things that happens to Korea in the 20th century. Okay. And then the final one that I'll touch on is American support for anti-communist dictators in Korea. So from about 1962 until 1988, Korea is ruled, South Korea, by a series of anti-communist military dictators. And here's one here, Park Chung-hee, meeting with JFK in the White House. Now, in some respects, the ROK was very fortunate in that the dictators that they had were very development-minded. They were less corrupt than many dictatorial regimes around the world. They invested in developing the Korean economy and really did some very good things for Korea in an economic and military sense. Now, however, if you were a Korean during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s who wanted to see liberal rights, who wanted to see a free press, okay, who wanted many of the freedoms that we take for granted in the United States, this was a very, very dark time. Okay, and to cross someone like Park Chung-hee was to be harassed, it was to be beaten, it was to be tortured, and in some cases killed. And when Korea democratized, there were many Koreans who were involved in that movement who looked back and who thought the United States should have been doing more. The United States should have been pushing harder to make Korea democracy sooner, to support democracy movements in Korea, to side with the anti-government forces. And they think that the United States did not do enough. Okay, so these are the tensions in history that underlie the alliance. All right, so from the Korean perspective, when they see Americans, they do not see a country that only has saved them from a communist invasion. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. They don't see the United States as just a savior. They value the American alliance. They're grateful for American intervention in the Korean War. They're grateful for American security guarantees, but there's a longer history here. And they wonder sometimes whether the United States is a reliable ally. It has not always been a reliable ally in the past, and they wonder at what point it might not be a reliable ally in the future. So those are the historical tensions that inform the present relationship. Okay, so that's the history part of my talk. So now I want to focus on tensions over North Korea. I think it's very, very hard for Americans to understand that South Koreans do not view North Korea the same way that we do. Okay, they have a fundamentally different lens. When we see North Korea, most Americans, we see a security threat. Okay, we see nuclear weapons, we see ICBMs, we see a huge army. We see a security threat that needs to be solved. Okay, from the South Korean perspective, they do not see North Korea primarily as a security threat, but rather as a national tragedy. Okay, and a national tragedy that was not of their own making. Remember, it's not Koreans who divide Korea, not initially. They play their own role later. But the initial division of Korea was an American idea. All right. And I think it's helpful. And if you can use your imaginations with me for a moment, I like to do this exercise with Americans. Imagine that tomorrow, the state of Wisconsin is divided down the I-39 corridor by a foreign power. Okay, it's divided. And if you have family on the other side, you never see them again. Okay, for 70 years, you never see them again. You have almost no communication with them. And yet the same outside power keeps telling you over and over again, I'm from the La Crosse area. Those people in Green Bay are dangerous. Okay, they're dangerous. They're a threat to peace and security. They're a threat to you. And that might be true. Okay, and you know that. However, at the same time, you also know that your brother-in-law lives in Green Bay, and your second cousin, and your great uncle live in Green Bay, and they were all nice, they were all nice people, and you're not sure what's going on with them now. All right, but even if they are a threat, you still recognize that you're all Wisconsinites. Okay, you all speak the same language, you all eat cheese, you all still support the Packers, you all live through these terrible winters together. All right, that is somewhat, if you can use your imagination and try to imagine what that would be like, that is somewhat akin to how South Koreans view North Koreans. They don't see them primarily as a security threat. They understand that they're threatening. They understand that they're dangerous, but they also understand that they are their ethnic kin. Okay, they are their brothers and their sisters. They are their extended family. Okay, and that the situation in North Korea right now is the result of a historical tragedy that was not of their own making. All right, and it's not that they don't believe that North Korea is not dangerous. They do understand that North Korea is dangerous and that North Korea poses a certain threat. But there's a sort of fatalism that exists in South Korea about this threat. They have had to deal with this threat for so long, their entire lives, that in some ways they've become immune to it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But way more worrying goes on in Washington, D.C. about North Korean nuclear weapons than goes on in Seoul. Okay. And I think even Americans in Wisconsin are more worried probably about North Korean nuclear weapons than most South Koreans are. And they believe, and I think this is dangerous, but you'll hear this often, that they don't ever believe that those nuclear weapons will be used on them. I'm not sure that that is necessarily the case, but it's a common belief. And also, somewhat paradoxically, they fear Japan almost as much, if not more, than North Korea. And this is a real barrier in U.S.-Korean relations. The U.S. and Korea are allies. The U.S. and Japan are allies. And the United States would like to see much more trilateral cooperation in East Asia between these three parties. And it doesn't happen because many Koreans have a very difficult relationship with Japan. So there's these tensions over North Korea. We fundamentally view North Korea differently, and it means that we prefer different policy solutions. Okay, so that's the American versus Korean differences. However, there's also differences within the ROK itself over how to handle North Korea, and the differences are between the two political traditions in modern Korea, the conservatives and the progressives. Korean politics is basically a two-party system like the United States, although there's a few other minor parties and the names of the parties change all the time, but they're basically can be grouped into conservative and progressive camps. Now, this is a problem when you try to explain this to Americans because those two terms mean nothing like what they mean in the United States. And if I can just go out on a limb here and say that the difference between conservatives and liberals in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years is over the role of government in American society. Do you want a big government or a small government? And on social issues, okay? Gay marriage, abortion, those sorts of things, okay? Korean society is very different. And I like to tell people, economically, all Koreans are socialists. All Koreans want a big government. They all like intervention. They all like a large state. Culturally, they're all conservative. Okay, so economically, they're all socialists. Culturally, they're conservatives. What divides Korean politics, being conservatives and progressives, is actually their views on the United States and on North Korea. These are the fundamental issues in Korean politics today. If you're a conservative in the Korean political spectrum, that means you want a close relationship with the United States and you're skeptical towards North Korea. Okay, you are not hawkish on North Korea. No Koreans are hawkish on North Korea. No Koreans want to take any action that might lead to a war with North Korea. But you do not want to take the first step. And you think the North Koreans should take the first step. Okay, they should show that they're serious about change, about denuclearization, and then we'll move. Okay, so you want a close relationship with the United States and you're skeptical towards the North. If you're a progressive in the South Korean perspective, it's the opposite. Okay, you want a warmer closer relationship with the North. You want to improve inter-Korean relations, and you think the ROK should be the leader in that. You think the ROK should be taking the first step, and you're somewhat skeptical of the United States, okay, for the history that we've just described, and also because you're worried that the United States is actually what's holding inter-Korean relations back, all right? So if you're progressive, you want a more proactive policy towards the North, and you worry that the United States might get in the way. So you can imagine that US ROK cooperation on North Korea can really change dramatically depending on which party or which political tradition is in power, the conservatives or the progressives, all right? And this leads me to the last point in these tensions over North Korea, and that is the current administration. So the current Korean administration is a progressive. His name is Moon Jae-in. And Moon Jae-in is a protege of one of the first Korean democratically elected presidents, Kim Dae-jung, who was famous for his sunshine policy approach towards North Korea. And the sunshine policy, it gets its name from the Aesop fable, where two winds are trying to blow the jacket off a man. And the harder they blow, the more he grips his jacket and pulls it down. And the sun comes in and says, I can solve this. I can fix this. And the sun shines brightly and it warms the man up. And then he takes off his jacket because he's warm now and he doesn't need it anymore. This was Kim Dae-jung's approach to North Korea. Let's have the ROK make the first move. Let's offer them aid. Let's offer them incentives to cooperate on economic issues. And let's watch them evolve. Okay, we don't expect them to take the first step. We will take the first step. Moon Jae-in was very close to Kim Dae-jung. And so when he was elected in 2017, he enacted a similar set of policies, which are derogatorily called the moonshine policies. Okay, if Kim Dae-jung had the sunshine policy, Moon Jae-in's last name is Moon. So now we have the moonshine policy on North Korea. Now, this is a derogatory term, but I feel like it's very clever and also somewhat amusing. So I like to refer to it as the moonshine policy. And that is that Moon Jae-in would like to see enhanced dialogue between the ROK, the DPRK, and the US, okay? So he really hated early Trump. He really did not like the fire and fury Trump of 2017. He was a bigger fan of, say, the middle Trump, the symmetry Trump of 2018 and 2019, and then kind of wondering where the last Trump was on US DPRK relations. So he would like enhanced dialogue with North Korea. He would also like to facilitate some sanctions relief for North Korea in return for a reduction in North Korea's nuclear capacity. Okay, that is one of his main policy objections. And he would like to restart economic engagement with North Korea. One of the things that Moon Jae-in has sought and that he has not gotten is he would like an ethnic exemption to American and UN sanctions on North Korea. All right. He is really limited in the aid he can give to North Korea and in the partnerships he can work on with North Korea because of the sanctions regimes, okay? And the ROK, if it offers aid to North Korea, broad aid, it would be violating these sanctions. And so one of the things he's asked for is, can we have a Korean exemption, an ethnic exemption to these sanctions? As Koreans, can we be exempted from these so we can try to work on our own policy with North Korea? And he has not received that exemption either from the United States or from the UN. Okay, and this causes tension in the alliance. So the tensions over North Korea are very key. Okay, and it's especially key when you consider that one of the reasons the alliance is there is to guarantee the security of the Korean Peninsula and essentially act as a check on North Korean aggression. This is one of the keys of the alliance. It's not the only key, but it's one of the reasons the alliance is there. But yet there's real tensions over how to do that between Koreans and Americans, and then between Americans and Korean progressives versus Korean conservatives. All right. It's very important that we have a sense of how the ROK views North Korea if we're going to understand where some of the tensions in the alliance are. All right. So we've talked about tensions over history. We've talked about tensions over North Korea, and then we'll finish with tensions over the alliance itself. Okay, tensions over questions of stability and over questions of its future. Okay, and I have a couple of points here, a couple of very recent tensions that have come up in the alliance. The first one is tensions over special measures agreements. Okay, special measures agreements are the cost sharing agreements between the US and ROK government where they actually decide who's going to pay for what costs of the alliance, okay? And haggling over these special measures agreements, or SMAs, can be somewhat contentious. But previous to Donald Trump, there was a pattern, okay? And there was a philosophy that was generally followed. And that was, and by the way, this is the American philosophy with special measures agreements all over the world. We sign these with Germany, we sign them with Japan, we sign them with Korea. And the philosophy behind them has broadly been similar before Donald Trump. And that was that the host nation should bear the costs of stationing troops in their country above what it would cost to have those same troops in the United States, okay? And the idea is that the United States has a number of troops that it deems necessary to protect its own interests, okay? And they have to be stationed somewhere. So if we were going to station them in the United States, it would cost one thing. If we're going to station them abroad and it's going to cost more money, then the host nation should pay those additional costs. So they don't pay all the costs. They pay the costs above what it would be to have them stationed in the United States, all right? Now, the problem with the ROK is that historically, it's almost always been cheaper to station troops in the ROK than it is in the United States, okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that. So the deals made with the ROK government has been that the ROK government will pay construction costs, maintenance costs on bases, and it will pay the salaries of all of the Korean workers. And there's thousands of them that work on these bases, that do essential services, that do things like janitorial work, that work in commissaries, that sort of thing. And the formulas for this are rather opaque, but 5-year SMAs had been negotiated with great regularity until Donald Trump, okay? And the Koreans were paying around $1 billion a year, okay? So a lot of money. The Trump administration came in demanding that the Koreans pay $5 billion a year. They demanded a 5-fold increase in the next SMA. And it was unclear as to even how they got that number, okay? And a few leaks out of the Trump administration indicated that they figured the total cost of stationing those 28,000 troops anywhere and then added 50% on top of that, okay? So that number of 5 billion, that was not just going to be a cost sharing measure, that was actually going to be a revenue generating agreement for the United States. And the South Koreans said no. They absolutely refused. They made a counteroffer. No one's quite sure what it was. It was probably a modest increase. And the Trump administration walked away. And so there is currently no SMA about the cost sharing in the alliance, okay? Which means currently Korean workers who work at the bases are furloughed, okay? Maintenance is being deferred. New construction is not happening. And this is going to be a real big task for the Biden administration that they're going to want to figure out pretty soon. They're going to want to negotiate a new SMA agreement with Korea to figure out who is going to pay what in the alliance. And it's always been contentious. I would say it's going to be even more contentious this time around because of the previous administration politicizing this issue and making what should be a bureaucratic tangle between bean counters actually a nationalistic issue, both in Korea and somewhat in the United States, okay? So there's tensions right now over cost sharing in the alliance. Now, there's also tensions over military modernization and weapons systems, particularly over THAAD. THAAD is Terminal High Altitude Anti-Missile Defense System, okay? It is a cutting-edge anti-missile defense system. And it was introduced into the ROK in 2017. And American policymakers felt that it was necessary because of North Korean advancements in their missiles, but it was also necessary, and just to go back this slide for a minute, this image is an image of the US garrison at Camp Humphreys. This is a brand new base built in South Korea. It's the largest American military base anywhere outside the United States, anywhere in the world. And what they did was they concentrated American forces from bases all over Korea into one location. And there were really good reasons for doing that. But one of the things it did is it made American troops in Korea more vulnerable. Okay, now they're all in one place. And so American leaders felt that THAAD was necessary to defend American personnel in Korea from a possible North Korean attack. Well, the problem was that the Chinese really did not like this. And they felt that THAAD on South Korea gave the Americans certain capabilities that they didn't have before for surveillance into China. Okay, THAAD has some very powerful radars. They claim that they could look into China. They could discover things about Chinese missiles that they didn't want Americans knowing. And the Chinese government pressured the ROK very strongly not to take it, okay? The administration of Park Geun-hye, the previous South Korean president, went ahead with it anyway. and China retaliated against South Korea for doing this. It cut off all tourism to South Korea almost overnight. It did other things short of sanctions and tariffs, but it put a lot of economic pressure on South Korea. And it really, really hurt the Korean economy in the short term. And this decision also hurt Pak Geun-hye because the THAAD missile battery does not cover the city of Seoul. It covers the southern part of the peninsula where the US forces are, but it does not cover Seoul. All right, so many on the progressive side felt that Pak Geun-hye made a real mistake by antagonizing China and not greatly increasing Korea's defensive capabilities. But this calls into question military cooperation between the ROK and US, especially over new weapon systems and modernization. Is THAAD going to be the pattern for the future? Every time the US and the ROK try to upgrade weapon system, are they going to have to deal with the Chinese about this? This is a real tension in the alliance, okay? And then there's tensions over the future of the alliance itself, okay? How reliable are American security guarantees, okay? 8 years ago, Koreans would have said they're rock solid, okay? After the last 4 years, they're not so certain. And the ROK has another problem, and that is that its main security ally is the United States. And this ally is 6,000 miles away, while its main economic partner is China, and it is right next door. And of course, the US and China relationship is experiencing a certain level of deterioration, all right? And now this is not going to be a problem for tomorrow. This is not even going to be a problem for 10 years from now. I think the United States is committed to this alliance at least for that period of time. But from the vantage point of Seoul, if you're thinking long term, if you're thinking out 50, 100 years, you have to think that the United States is not going to be there forever. But the United States will always be 6,000 miles away. There's no changing geography. And China will always be next door, all right? And so how do you manage? How do you manage that tension, all right? One way to manage it would be closer cooperation with Japan. And this is what Americans have been pushing for years. Trilateral cooperation in East Asia between Korea, Japan, and the United States. But the Koreans, for their own reasons of history and policy and politics, are hesitant to do that, okay? So these are real stresses that are at the center of the alliance, okay? There's historical stresses. There's stresses over North Korea, and there's stresses over the structure and the future of the alliance. However, I'm an optimist. So I just want to end on a somewhat optimistic note, because I feel like all we've talked about is tensions, okay? Despite these tensions, and they're real, I am an optimist. And the reason I'm an optimist is because we've been here before. There's been tensions in the US-ROK alliance before. Probably one of the most tense moments in the alliance was in 2002 after the Yangju Highway incident, when an American military vehicle struck and killed 2 Korean schoolgirls. And there was demonstrations all over the country, like this one you see here, okay, where Koreans are gathering to tear apart American flags and say some very unflattering things. And during this anti-American outbreak, for the first time, pollsters actually revealed that a majority of Koreans were questioning whether the United States should stay in Korea, whether American forces should be asked to leave, okay? But what happened during this period of tension is that the 3 key constituents of the alliance, of the 3, 2 of them got together. And by 3 constituents of the alliance, I consider that the ROK government, the American government, and the Korean people. Those are the key constituencies of the alliance. I don't think the American people are actually a key constituency. I don't think most Americans care about the US-ROK alliance enough. So what happened in 2002 is you have pressure on the alliance from the Korean people. But the American and the Korean governments got together and said, the alliance is too important. We can manage this. We will make it right. We will do reparations. We will make apologies. We will do what's necessary to make sure the alliance stays strong. What you have in the last 4 years under former President Donald Trump is you have unprecedented pressure on US-ROK alliance, okay? You have Donald Trump openly talking about trying to remove US troops from South Korea. You have him calling Koreans free riders on American security, saying that Korea was once part of China, calling the EC the Sea of Japan, poking the Koreans in all the sensitive spots, okay? It could have been a disaster for the alliance. And yet it wasn't, because you had pressure from the American government. But the Korean people and the Korean government got together and said, we're not going to be provoked into this. Okay, we are not going to destroy the alliance over this. The alliance is too valuable to us. And then, fortunately, you also had some very responsible Republican congressmen who added language to the defense authorization bill in December of 2018 and December of 2019 that said that you cannot withdraw troops. The president cannot withdraw troops from South Korea unless the Secretary of Defense comes before Congress and explains why they're being withdrawn and explains that this withdrawal will not in any way harm the U.S.-Korean reliance. The U.S.-Korean alliance. Okay, so you've had pressure on the alliance from these different points before, but generally the other key constituencies come together and say the alliance is not breaking down over this. Now, if all three constituencies would be putting pressure on the alliance at once, then I think it's hard to tell what would happen. And then just very quickly in closing, I will say that the last reason I'm optimistic is that Koreans and Americans generally share a common vision of the world. Okay, we have very different cultures. We have very different societies. We speak different languages. We're rooted in different traditions. But when Americans look out at the world and when Koreans look out at the world, they want to see a society that's based on rules. They want to see democracy. They want to see liberal rights. They want to see more or less free trade, free market economics. There is a lot of scope for cooperation and a lot of scope for shared interests. The US-ROK alliance will not last forever, but I think it has a lot of life left in it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Great. Thank you very much, David. We have a couple of questions here, some having to do with some terminology that perhaps you can clarify a little bit. The first one was asking about that in going back to your historical portion, that the Korean-American Treaty uses the term Kingdom of Chosen. And the question was, does this have anything to do with the Chosun education laws? Is Chosen and Chosun referring to the same thing? I hope I'm getting the pronunciations here correctly. Just referring to Korea, or is there some difference in terminology?
So I have to say, I am not 100% sure what the Chosun education laws are, but Chosun is an older name for Korea. So the Kingdom of Korea was referred to as Chosun for several hundred years. Chosen is the Japanese pronunciation of that name, which was used during the colonial period. So you will often see both of them, you'll see them used in different contexts depending on the time period. So if it was something written on Korea between 1910 and 1940, or if it was something that had a particularly Japanese perspective, they will use Chosen, S-E-N, because that's the Japanese pronunciation. Unfortunately, Korean has gone through revised romanization several times. So actually the C-H-O-S-U-N spelling, there are now several different variants, but it all means the same thing. It's just an older name for Korea. I believe that the word for Korea actually is even an older name that somehow the Dutch picked up and introduced to the English-speaking world. I believe it goes back to the ancient kingdom of Goryeo, which is even before the Chosun period. But that is the name that became dominant in English. And of course, well, maybe not of course, the name for Korea today is Hanguk. Okay, Daehanminguk. Hanguk is generally the modern word that Koreans claim for themselves.
Great. The second one had to do with more policy issues. And you talked about the sunshine policy and the moonshine policy and that terminology. But someone asked for just a little bit of clarification if there was the play on words, but is there a fundamental difference in that policy, or is it just second generation of leaders?
I would say that probably depends on who you asked. If you ask Moon Jae-in, he would probably say, it's inspired by the sunshine policy, but what we're doing is we're going to learn the mistakes of what went wrong in the sunshine policy, and we're going to keep the same basic philosophy, but we're going to do it smarter this time. Okay. I feel like if you asked his critics, they would say, no, it's exactly the same policy over and over again. And this is not helpful. It didn't work the first time. There's no reason to think it would work the second time. I will say about the moonshine policy, though, even though it's been a priority for Moon Jae-in, an interesting thing that's happened is there's been pressure on him from within his own party to just move ahead with his policies, even despite sanctions. Even if this would mean South Korea violating international sanctions, that he should go ahead with it because inter-Korean relations is that important. And Moon Jae-in has refused to do that. And he has said, no, we cannot risk a rupture in the alliance at this time. At least I should say that's what it appears at this time. it would come out about 10 years after the Sunshine Policy that Kim Dae-jung was doing many things in regard to aid to North Korea that were not common knowledge at the time. So it is possible that right now Moon Jae-in might be violating some sanctions in some way to try to jumpstart an inter-Korean dialogue, but there's no evidence of that at this time.
David, there's a question about the kidnapping of South Koreans and being spirited back into North Korea that seemed to have been an occurrence for several decades. Is that still continuing? What was the impetus behind that? Could you maybe talk a bit more about that phenomenon?
So that hasn't happened for quite some time. I would say it's much more common that the North Koreans were kidnapping Japanese and spiriting them away to North Korea. And this is a huge issue in US-Japan relations that, I'm sorry, in DPRK-Japan relations, that the Japanese feel that the DPRK, one, they weren't honest about this. And then two, when they finally admitted it, they said, yes, we did steal these people, but they were all dead. But then three, they were not able to convincingly produce remains for all of them. So this remains a huge issue in DPRK-Japan relations. In regards to the ROK, it did happen, especially right after the Korean War. In fact, there was a case of a jet that was hijacked, that was flown to North Korea, and all of the citizens of South Korea detained. And I think maybe some of the crew was released, but most of them have never been seen from again. For better or for worse, North Korean human rights violations against South Koreans do not seem to get the same traction in South Korea that they do around the world. And I think for some of the issues that I've just discussed, because their primary lens of viewing North Korea is that of a historical national tragedy. And Korea is almost more to be pitied than it is to be feared. And so one of the issues that conservatives and progressives will often fight about is the conservatives would like to see the progressives take North Korea to task for human rights abuses. And the progressives are very, very hesitant to do that. So this is kind of a sub issue that divides Korean politics as well. But I'm not aware, now there have been some Americans of Korean ethnicity that have been detained in North Korea, but I'm not aware of too many recent cases of South Koreans actually being snatched and taken back to North Korea.
Good, thank you. Another question is, are the North Koreans hawkish towards the ROK? Do they welcome the moonshine policy? Any chance of negotiations between Koreans without the rest of the world participating?
Oh, now, in many ways, among Korean scholars, this is one of the most lively debates, and I think one of the most important debates, and that is, what is North Korea's actual intention towards South Korea? So there's the rhetoric, and the rhetoric is always unification by force. We tried it in 1950, it didn't work, but North Korea has never abandoned this. And if you visit North Korea and drive around, you will see every billboard pushing one of two things, pushing the dear leader, the great leader, and the revolution, or pushing reunification by force. Okay, they're very clear on this from their propaganda. So, but it also seems apparent from the outside that they don't have the ability to do this, right? They would be, if they tried to attack South Korea, they would be destroyed. God forbid they would win. What are they going to do with South Korea? There's twice as many South Koreans as there are North Koreans. South Korea is a much richer society. There's no way that they could possibly ingest South Korea. So the division between Korean scholars is, are they serious about unification, or is this just rhetoric that it's a holdover from an old era that they use to fire up crowds, but they're not really serious about? And I was of that opinion until a few years ago when a high-level defector named Tae Young-ho defected. He was the ambassador to London, and he gave some fascinating testimony in US Congress saying, no, they are very serious about unification by force. And when he was asked that question of how would they ingest South Korea, and he said their point of reference is Hanoi and South Vietnam in 1975. South Vietnam was richer than the North. Militarily, on paper, it was stronger than the North. Okay, I believe it was more populous North, I'm not sure. But what happened is when the Americans left, South Vietnam just imploded, and the North was able to take it over and ingest it. And North Koreans, he claims that North Koreans believe the same thing. And that scared me fundamentally, because I think they're wrong about that. I think actually the ROK is fundamentally much, much more sound and a strong society than South Vietnam was. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the North Korean leadership thinks. And if they think that there's an opening for them to reunify the Korean Peninsula by force, and that's a viable alternative for them, if the Americans are off the peninsula, well, that changes so much about how you interpret North Korean intentions. Okay. So I am now of the opinion that I think they are actually serious about unification by force. I don't think this is something that they're planning on doing tomorrow or next decade, but I think a long-term goal of theirs is to break the US-ROK alliance, get the United States off the Korean Peninsula, and then they have options. And unification by force would be one of those options.
Good. Thank you. David, I think we've got a couple of more questions. Would you like to?
Yeah, so there's a couple here about Japan, and you talked about the fact that that South Koreans are more fearful of Japan than they are perhaps of North Korea. And another question that praises this for an amazingly accurate and clear and comprehensive talk. And this colleague of mine, actually, who's from Korea, asked whether what you think about Japan's true intention and their future action on South Korea, the Republic of Korea. So why are the South Koreans so fearful, and can you speculate about Japan's true intentions towards the ROK?
One of the things that's happened in the past few years is, if you're unaware, the Japanese currently are operating under a constitution right now that was written by the Americans. It was written by Douglas MacArthur when the United States defeated Japan in World War II. And it's officially a pacifist constitution. Okay, Japan in its constitution has disavowed the right to go to war. Now they have defense forces that are some of the best defense forces you will find anywhere in the world. In fact, if they weren't called defense forces, Japan they have a major armed forces, okay? But they are harnessed, they're held back by this constitution. And in the last few years, there's been a movement in Japan to revise this constitution, okay? To get rid of pacifism or to water down the pacifist clause. And this has really unnerved a lot of Koreans, and it's unnerved a lot of Chinese because, they remember, or they actually, most of them don't remember because they weren't around, but the narratives of what the Japanese did to the Chinese and the Koreans in the 20th century, it's taught in schools. I got my start in a Korean public school as a teacher, and I was amazed and somewhat appalled at what Koreans were taught about the Japanese. I mean, the nationalist flames burned strong in the Korean educational system. And so with this issue of constitutional revision coming up, I think many Koreans are afraid of what this might mean. It's really hard for me as an American to judge what ultimately the Japanese intentions are, and things can change over time. But if I was giving advice to Koreans right now and was going to advise them, I would encourage them to think about the future rather than the past. Okay, there is a troubled past between a lot of countries, including between the US and Korea and the US and Japan. We all have these historical issues. We can't change them, and in many ways, I don't think we can ever atone for things that went wrong in the past, but we can focus on the future. And I feel like I would encourage Koreans to take a very hard look at the trajectory that Japan is on and have them assess where they think Japan is heading. Have them assess whether they think, and a real objective, open-minded assessment of where are the Japanese putting their resources. Okay, what is the narrative that is being taught in Japan about their past? And that might unnerve some of them. It might give some of them confidence. Okay, I can't say what the future would hold, but I would encourage both sides to look to the future rather than to look to the past.
David, we keep getting some really good questions in. It's going to be difficult to get to all of them, but there's one kind of bringing it up to the current administration. How do you predict the Biden administration will handle relations with both North and South Korea? And how would that contrast perhaps with the Trump administration's approach?
My guess, and this is no more than a guess, is I do not think that they were going to follow the Trump approach either to South Korea or to North Korea. I do not see them putting a lot of pressure on the US-ROK alliance. In fact, I think they're going to go out of their way to try to repair the US-ROK alliance. And it is in need of some TLC right now. And so I would think that they're going to try to make these SMA negotiations as painless as possible, probably try to keep it behind closed doors, get just a modest increase, and try to reassure South Korea that we are an ally for the long haul, and we're an ally because it's in both of our interests to be an ally. Okay, I do not think they're going to pursue the same transactional approach. And on North Korea, I would be very surprised if they would return to either of the Trump approaches, which was fire and fury on one hand and summits on the other. I see both of those scenarios as very unlikely. I think probably the most likely scenario is returning back to what Obama's policy was of strategic patience. I hope that maybe what they would do, and this would be my hope, is that they acknowledge that the North Korean nuclear weapons are not an American problem. They're not a problem that the United States can solve on its own in a bilateral fashion. And I would like to see them move back to the six-party talks, where you get China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, and North Korea together, or even broaden it out and say this is an issue for the UN. Because the truth is, in my opinion, there's no solution to this problem, okay? So what do you do when you have a problem that there's no solution to? You try to share the burden. You try to share the blame. You work with as many allies as you possibly can. And you make sure that the North Koreans understand that this is not a fight between you and us. The North Koreans love to portray their weapons program as a fight between them and Americans, when really it's an affront to the entire world. Okay, it's an affront to the international community what the North Koreans do. And I think if the United States could communicate that to the North Koreans, that you're not going to get anywhere, we're not even going to interact with you on a one-on-one basis, I think we would all be better off. So that would be my preference, but I'd be really surprised if they return to either of the Trump strategies.
Thank you. I think we might have time for two more. Dr. Corey, would you like to lead off with the penultimate?
Yeah, there's following up on that a little bit, some questions about what your speculation is for the possibility of reunification. I mean, is this just, you know, you said that the US-ROK relationship is not going to exist forever, but I mean, looking into your crystal ball, do you see the division of the Koreas going on forever to that end?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And as many scholars have pointed out, Koreans have 4,000 years of history in something that looks very much like a nation. This is what's so interesting about Korea. You know, back when, you know, the entity that we now call Germany was several different tribes of Germanic speaking peoples, the same way with the French, same way with the British. The Koreans were one people speaking one language, sharing one culture, and sharing a defined space for thousands and thousands of years. And I think there's an immense gravitational pull towards Korean reunification, and I think it will happen. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think the North Korean regime is very stable. I like to describe it like this: it's like a tower made of iron. It's very, very strong. It can last a very long time, but it's not very flexible. Okay, and the right kind of shocks applied at the right time and in the right place could cause it all to go crumbling down. So I don't see that happening, but it's within the realm of possibility. So I think in the long term, and when I mean long term, I mean maybe 100 years, I think Korea will eventually be reunified, and will either be reunified by the North imploding or by the North changing. But I don't see any of those happening for decades.
All right, David, perhaps one last question, and then we're going to let you go. How does China regard South Korea? Is it a threat? Is it an economic partner? How would you define that relationship?
That is also a really interesting question. I don't think they view South Korea as a threat by any means. But I think just where South Korea fits in China's long-term plans is something of a mystery. And on the one hand, it seems like a friendly South Korea would be very much in the Chinese interest. On the other hand, what the Chinese did in 2017 after the THAAD deployment to the peninsula, if they thought that they were going to cow the South Koreans into not accepting the weapons or into recognizing a Chinese sphere of influence in Korea, then they were wrong, because primarily what it did is it made the Koreans mad. Okay. And the Chinese right now could be making things much more difficult for the Americans if they would be playing nice with South Korea, okay? If they would be gently trying to induce South Korea maybe into accepting a closer relationship with them rather than punishing them for their relationship with Americans. So I don't think China views South Korea as a threat, but whatever they're hoping to accomplish in South Korea, I'm not sure that they're going about it in a very wise way right now. And I think the same could be said of many of their other relationships. Okay. I feel like Donald Trump abused so many countries all around the world that China could be filling the vacuum in some ways. And yet, if what they're doing is attempting to do that, they're not doing a very good job. Okay, they seem to be alienating countries almost as badly as Donald Trump was. So just what the Chinese strategy is towards South Korea is something of a mystery to me.
Good. Unfortunately, we are not able to get to all the questions. And for those of you who posted some in the Q&A and we did not get to them, I apologize. But thank you so much for contributing to this discussion. Dr. Fields, thank you again for joining us and really sharing a depth of expertise that is badly needed on this set of issues. So thank you so much. For everyone else, remind you that the next in this series will be on the melting Arctic. Dr. Rebecca McCain from St. Norbert will be talking about the impact of climate change on the Arctic ice caps and the environment. So please join us for that. You can register again at the Great Decisions webpage at St. Norbert College. And in the meantime, look for this recording on that same site in the next couple of days. For now, though, thank you all very much for joining. Dr. Curry, any last words of wisdom and exhortation?
Just again, excellent presentation. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your knowledge, and everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you again in a couple weeks.
Thank you.
And anybody who had questions that didn't get that answered, I encourage you to email me directly. It may take some time for me to respond to you, but I would be happy to address your questions.
Very good. Thank you. Good night, everyone.